So a couple weeks ago, I released a video talking about Alear, the protagonist of Fire Emblem Engage. The video in question was a critique of their character and how I felt that the game failed to do its protagonist justice by forcing them to constantly live in the shadow of other Fire Emblem heroes. The feedback to this video was mostly positive, but there was one commenter by the name of FairyAngelBel who had a lot to say in response to my takes. 3 comments worth of a response, in fact. What I initially assumed was just going to be an angry rant turned out to be a surprisingly thoughtful and respectful critique of my main points, and even got me to consider some things in a new light. While I initially planned to respond in text form, I didn't want to create a chain of long text posts in the comments section. So, with Bell's permission, I have chosen to make a follow-up video addressing some of their key counterarguments. Before we can really dive into it, though, a disclaimer. The main goal here is to keep the discussion civil. Harassment of any kind toward anyone will not be tolerated. Furthermore, I understand fully that at the end of the day, some people will just have different feelings and opinions than my own. If you like Alear as a character in spite of all my critiques, honestly, that's fine. I get it. I understand very well how it feels to have characters I'm fond of attacked by the broader fandom. So yes, while I do still ultimately think that Alear's potential was squandered, I'm at least willing to hear out the other side of the argument and do my best to address it fairly. With all of that being said, let's not beat around the bush. There's a lot to go over, so I think it's best that we just jump right in. To start, let's address Alear's role as a deity-like figure in Ilios. As I mentioned in the original video, Alear suffers a bit from the protagonist worship trend that the last few Fire Emblem games have going on. In Alear's case, they are quite literally worshipped by the entire cast. There's an entire religion built around Lumera and her child, and everyone treats Alear with a fair degree of reverence despite the fact that Alear themselves are fairly unremarkable at the end of the day. They don't seem to have any actual power beyond the emblem rings, unlike their mother who can turn into a dragon, conjure golems, and likely all manner of other feats we don't know about. Bell points out that Alear likely feels pressure to live up to the expectations that come from being thrust into such a role, especially since they lack any sort of grandiose abilities of their own. Alear even explicitly states that they don't want to be put on a pedestal. They don't want to be served or worshipped, but they still strive to live up to the legacy Lumera left behind and the hopes that the entire world has for them. Indeed, many of Alear's supports with those that deify them revolve around Alear wanting their followers to simply view them as just another person, a friend rather than a god. I think the main point of contention here comes from a line in my original video in which I say that the worship feels undeserved. In hindsight, this could stand to be elaborated on a little more. See, one of my biggest gripes with Engage's world building is how little we know or understand about its primary religion, despite playing as the centerpiece of that religion. For contrast, let's look at the Church of Saros in Three Houses. That game put a lot of time and effort into establishing how the faith in Fodlan works. People revere the goddess Sothis, whom they believe lives on a star in the heavens. The faith shares a lot of parallels with real-world Christianity, in which the deity people pray to watches over the world and may sometimes respond to prayers in subtle ways, but seldom if ever takes an active role in mortal affairs. The people of Fodlan believe that if Sothis really needs to do something drastic, she'll bestow a chosen saint, like Saros, Macwo, or Sethlene, with the power to perform miracles on her behalf. Of course, if you play through all of Three Houses, then you know that all of this is varying degrees of BS. But the broader populace of Fodlan doesn't know that. They believe the lies and altered truths that Rhea worked so hard to maintain. They believe that Sothis can actually hear their prayers, not knowing that their deity got turned into a sword and had her mind stuffed inside a dead child. They have no idea that the saints they regard as heavenly overseers are actually still alive and also are really dragons masquerading as humans. Now, with all of that in mind, allow me to ask, how exactly does the divine dragon faith work? We know that people have churches they go to in order to pray to Lumera and Alear, but can those two actually hear any prayers? Nothing in the game suggests they can, and there's certainly no evidence that praying to them would actually do anything. In fact, Mavier's mom goes over to the Church of the Fell Dragon specifically because her prayers went unanswered. So, did Lumera just not care about her dead husband? Was it not in Lumera's power to heal him? Or, like we said before, can she just not actually literally hear people praying to her at an altar? In that note, I honestly don't see much of a reason for anyone in Elios to pray when, unlike Sothis, the divine dragons are deities that actively are known to exist in the world. It's common knowledge in Elios that the divine dragons are just hanging out right in the middle of the map, and one of them has been in a coma for the last several centuries. It feels a bit goofy to me that the people of the world would feel the need to beg their deities for help at some distant church or altar when they could just go to Lethos and ask Lumera for help, or at least send her a letter or something. Even then, it's not entirely clear how powerful Lumera actually is as a deity. Granted, we have seen dragons in this franchise perform some wild feats, like turning back time or even restoring a destroyed world. But can the divine dragons of Elios do things like that? Do they have the power to bestow someone with good fortune, ensure a bountiful harvest, or bring about fair weather? Alear certainly doesn't seem capable of anything like that, especially not while sleeping, and it's hard to say what the exact extent of Lumera's power is. I think the most miraculous thing she ever does is conjuring golems in the tutorial. Of course, I realize that uncertainty is a key part of faith, but again, that kind of falls flat when the deities you're praying to are right there. What? Did Lumera just tell everyone, hey guys, my kid is in a coma after fighting Sombron, but feel free to pray to them if you want. They can definitely hear you, and they can also assuredly answer your prayers while asleep. As for the praise and reverence our protagonist gets, well, I understand it to an extent. As Bell points out, Alear is still a hero who defeated the Fell Dragon ages ago. They are a living legend who has done genuine good for the world. So it makes sense that people would be at least a little starstruck around them. Even so, there is a significant difference between being praised as a hero and being praised as a deity. To summarize, I understand revering Alear as a hero and praising them in that regard. It's the fact that they're revered as a deity that I feel to be a little excessive, because we're never given any hint of Alear actually doing anything particularly godlike either before or after their slumber. And being honest, I just find the constant use of Divine One to be obnoxious. I know it's a placeholder for the actual character name like Professor was in Three Houses, considering you can technically name Alear whatever you want, but there had to have been a better alternative. Maybe just Your Highness, considering that Alear is technically a prince or a princess? Anyways, let's move on to the other main point of contention, the emblems. I've complained about these things at length, but the long and short of my initial argument is that the emblem rings are largely treated as a plot device to resolve every major conflict. They're a deus ex machina that both sides of the war are constantly taking back and forth from each other because of the power they possess. The emblems not only have the ability to grant their wearer a powerful transformation, but they can also perform miracles like raising a continent or even bringing back the dead, even if the latter is a special one-time only thing. Bell argues that the emblems are more than that, and that how Alear and Sombron treat them is a major point of contrast between the two. Sombron views them as nothing more than tools, while Alear views them as living entities. Bell argues that the breakdown scene in the church is not just because Alear is losing their rings. They're losing their friends and companions. We will come back around to discuss the church scene in greater detail later, but for now I will concede this. I can actually agree with this point to an extent. The main thing one has to consider is this. What are the emblem rings really? In a previous video, I've compared them to heroic spirits from the Fate franchise, and I honestly think that's the most apt comparison I can give. For context, heroic spirits and fate are, with some exceptions, not actually the original heroes they're based on. Heroic spirits are more like the embodiments of legends passed down through human history. They are stories brought to life, and so certain heroic spirits gain traits or powers based on iconic myths or legends about them. That's why Iskander, aka Alexander the Great, can be summoned with some degree of lightning powers. In life, there was a somewhat prominent rumor that Alexander was the son of Zeus, even if we know today that that's kind of BS. To that end, heroic spirits can be altered by emphasizing, adding, or even subtracting elements from their stories. The emblems appear to work in a rather similar way. Marth himself directly confirms this. The emblems we see and engage are not the original heroes. We're never really given a clear-cut origin story for how these emblems came to be in the main game, but they are, at best, reflections of heroes from beyond the world of Elios. The emblems may share memories and attitudes with the heroes they're based on, but as we see in the game, they can also be transformed into mindless killing machines. It all depends on whether they're exposed to divine or fell dragon power. It honestly raises a much deeper philosophical question about whether the emblems truly do count as people. But I suppose that is a bit of a moot point. Again, the simple fact that Alear is willing to view them as such while Sombron does not is a clear point of contrast between the protagonist and antagonist. What I do take issue with, however, is the way Alear's bonds with the emblems is presented to us. While they do sort of act as mentors and companions to the main cast in the story, it feels very shallow. The only one Alear is actually shown to have any real connection to is Marth, because Marth is Alear's canon partner emblem. Up until that point, the other emblems are all mostly bonded with other members of Alear's party. Sigurd with Alfred, Roy with Diamant, Micaiah with Yunaka, and so on. Even then, the others don't really get to do much bonding either. The most we really get are the paralogs in which Alear undergoes trials based on previous Fire Emblem maps, because there are locations in Elios that just inexplicably resemble locations from other worlds. This is never explained. The thing is, regardless of how we're meant to view them, the plot itself ultimately treats the emblems more as MacGuffins than characters. The spirits barely interact with the main cast at all, and what interactions they do have are relegated to supports that consist of a couple lines of dialogue at best. Even then, most of the conversations tend to just be, let's fight together, or here's a little reference to a previous game. With only a few exceptions, they're all super generic and don't really feel like any member of the actual main cast is seriously developing a deep connection with these spirits. On that note, let's go back to the church scene. I honestly feel like this entire moment falls apart with one simple question. Where did everybody go? Alear came in here with nothing short of a small army to face Hyacinth, and yet during the confrontation with Sombron, Vale, and the Four Hounds, all of Alear's friends and allies are just gone. Well, okay, that's not entirely true. People just randomly teleport in and out of the scene for no apparent reason. Like, it starts with Diamant next to Alear, only then he gets replaced with Alfred after Hyacinth gets eaten. Then, in the following cutscenes, Alear tells everyone to engage with the emblems. Everyone consisting of just Alfred and Vander, who has spontaneously come into existence. Vale then manages to steal the Draconic Time Crystal from Alear while their back is turned, because I guess she's secretly a thief class, and uses that to steal all the emblem rings, somehow. Like, did Alear have all 6 of the rings on their person at that moment? Or did Vale take them from Alear's non-existent allies? This entire scene is just so hilariously nonsensical when you stop and analyze what's happening. And the fact that Alear is the only one actually breaking down is the cherry on top. You know what would have made this moment work way better? If, for one thing, we got to see the rest of the main cast actually bonding with their respective emblems on screen. like Celica and Saline discussing the trials they both face as princesses, or having Leaf bond with, I don't know, Vander or Alcris. Leaf never actually gets a canon ring wearer, now that I think of it. Anyways, all of this could be in service to having all of the main cast break down at seeing their emblems taken. Alear, Yunaka, Alfred, Diamant, Saline, and Vander/Alchrist. Seeing the others despairing with Alear would honestly have given the scene way more impact, I think. They sort of do something like this the second time around the emblems are lost, but it's mostly just everyone lamenting the fact that they can't engage. Again, because the actual story is constantly using emblems as a plot device. Bell mentioned using gameplay as a way to tell the story, and the fact that Alear goes into many battles with the emblems as proof that they have a connection to these spirits, but not really. Because as a gameplay mechanic, the rings can be freely swapped around among your party members. Putting aside what builds are considered meta or even canon, I'd argue this kind of hurts more than it helps. Like, if I felt so inclined, I could give Marth to Alfred as soon as he joins the party and have a Lear fight without any emblems. Hell, I've even heard that there are some people who do challenge runs that involve not using the engage mechanic at all outside of where it's necessary. I know that's not the intended way to go about it, but from a gameplay standpoint, the rings are just kind of an excuse to give different buffs to different party members. Like, Corrin's ring is meant to be wielded by Seadoll, but once I learned that Vale gets free access to all Dragonbane abilities due to her class, I immediately switched Corrin over to her. I mean, if we're discussing using gameplay to illustrate a theme, there are a myriad of ways Engage could have gone about it differently. I'm sorry, but just throwing the word bond into things like bond fragments, bond supports, and bond rings does not make me believe the actual relationship between these characters is some unshakable source of strength. Better ways to have demonstrated that would be, I don't know, letting players pair characters together in certain activities. The best we really get is training, which is pseudo-randomized, and cooking, which I stopped using after a while given that it could randomly debuff my units before a battle rather than vice versa. As for the emblem rings, the main way to build bonds with them outside of the weird paralogs is just polishing their rings. Riveting. Like, imagine exploring the Somniel and you can just find characters chatting or doing stuff together. Maybe this could even be based off of their actual supports, like Tamara and Ivy sneaking off alone somewhere to practice singing, or Fram and Clan discussing ideas to bolster the popularity of their fan club. This could also apply with emblem rings and their wielders. Alear, especially, could benefit from some of the Three Houses style dialogue that lets them actually respond to things that people are saying. Also, you know what's really insane to me? There's no pair-up mechanic or adjutant system in this game where the idea of working together is supposed to be a central theme in the story. I know emblems kind of do that, but again, that feels less impactful since it never really feels like the spirits are developing a super deep bond with any of their battle partners. Unless, again, you want to count 1 minute talks about effectively nothing. But now I'm sort of veering away from just talking about Alear and more so talking about the game as a whole. So I think it's about time we rein this in and wrap things up. In conclusion, Bell, you make some very good points, and I think I can see what the writers were trying to accomplish. I just honestly don't believe that the overall execution of these ideas was particularly great. Engage's biggest problem, I think, is that it does a lot of telling and not much showing. Despite everything I've said, I don't hate Alear. I think they are an interesting character. They just never get the chance to truly shine in their own game.